Hey everyone, and welcome to the latest Digital Foundry Direct Weekly, and it's a very special one because we're celebrating the launch of our Patreon revamp, a relaunch, if you will. And joining me to talk about it, we've got the full house here pretty much, beginning with John Linneman.
Hey Rich, yeah, had to be here fresh off of the most recent project. It was dicey getting it done, but it is finished.
We'll talk about that in a bit. And Tom Morgan, Brighton, he's joining us.
Hello there. How's it going? Absolutely
fantastic. And he's got a lot to share about the game that we just can't stop talking about, the new Cyberpunk 2077. But we'll talk about that a bit later. And finally, last but certainly not least, the man of the hour.
Oh, thank you.
The man who helped to put the new Metro Exodus on the radar via a frankly phenomenal video. It's Alex Battaglia.
Yeah, it's less bright here though, and in Brighton and everywhere else. I don't know how well people could see that in the audience, but it's basically winter in Berlin again.
Okay, so where should we begin? Let's talk about the Patreon relaunch. It should be live by the time you see this. In fact, it will be. Otherwise, I'll probably be losing my job. And this will be the first episode that will be going out early to our Patreon supporters. So it's been a bit of a extended project, this one. We didn't really want it to disrupt the workflow too much. We've been doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes. We've had Audi obviously doing a lot of the wrangling. Don't really know where to begin on this. I suppose the Digital Foundry Premium tier, we can talk about that a bit. Lots of freebies and extras to enjoy there. 4K version of the Metal Gear Solid 2 AI upscale trailer there. Some DF classic FPS analysis remastered from the PlayStation 360 era, PlayStation 3 360 era. And we're going to be launching soon Tech Focus, a new episode there from Alex, which I think you're really excited about.
For sure, yeah. I can already decide. It's going to be about global illumination, which seems pretty topical given everything that's happening right now. And it's still being scripted. Because Tech Focus is a little bit different than another video where in other videos, I'll go out and I'll record games and I already know what I'm talking about. But Tech Focus already starts from a theoretical level, and then I have to search out things from my memory, essentially where I want to record in games. So it's a little bit different, still in production, but I think everyone will like it when it's done.
Excellent. And obviously available now to those who have supported the DF Retro supporter tier. Frankly phenomenal Quake video. Do you want to give us some headlines? We'll talk about it a bit more in depth later, but John, what's it all about?
Yeah, so basically the idea was to go back to Quake because that was the first game that I covered for DF Retro under that branding. That's the whole thing that kind of got the series started, but that original video was 5 minutes long and was mostly focused on the Saturn version. It was just kind of a quick thing that I did, but I wanted to go back and kind of talk about the game. And what I realized is that Quake is such a broad topic to the point where the video could have been like 8 hours and there's still more to talk about. Like, I actually had to cut down parts of my script originally just to keep the pacing up because there's so much to cover with this game. And that's kind of the whole thing about it, is going through its importance to the game industry, why it's still such a great game. But really exciting is really testing it across a wide range of hardware, including the rendition Verite, which I finally wanted to get some good footage out there of V-Quake, because that's the MS-DOS only accelerated version of Quake for that specific graphics card. And it looks completely different from every other conversion or source port, I guess, of Quake. It's different than GeoQuake and everything that came after, and it's really interesting to look at.
Brilliant. Well, we're going to be talking more about the Patreon relaunch a bit later on in the video. But suffice to say, all of this kind of tentpole content is available now for our supporters at the appropriate tiers. But I think the thing to stress is that that's going to be time limited. So there is going to be the opportunity for everybody to see it at some point.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Let's talk about the biggest news story of the week, I think. And it was actually an honor for us to break it, which was Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition. So, wow, this is pretty incredible, right, Alex?
Yeah, it's, I mean, I do preface it in the video, and the video's title does describe it, but it's essentially the first time we're looking at a game, specifically on PC as well, where it requires ray tracing hardware, acceleration, because they kind of went back into that original game from 2019, ripped out all of the rasterized faked lighting to emulate bounce lighting, and then drove it all now through ray tracing. And they expanded on the ray tracing with a lot of features like ray traced emissives, ray traced reflections, ray traced bounce lighting with infinite bounces and things like that from every single light source that cast shadows. So it's really big. And I think it just represents kind of like another milestone on this eventual road towards ray tracing being embraced by every single sector of the kind of video game graphics industry.
I think that, Alex, that's the most impressive thing to me is, and this is what's interesting, is the fact that they went back and basically re-arted the game specifically for this. This is sort of demonstrates the potential for fully ray traced games that do not have a fallback for classic rasterization. And it's a dramatic difference. I mean, obviously they've improved their tech, but the original 2019 version, as you covered, that was just a single bounce for the I guess
sun and moon.
Yeah, the sun and moon. And then I guess the add-on had more direct lights as well. But this one, it's like having infinite bounce from every light source like that. That's incredible.
It's a really, really big deal. And I was kind of the privileged aspect of it, other than breaking out into an exclusive video describing it, doing the usual analysis, even critique. I mean, obviously when we're given an exclusive, it's a privilege and we don't want to be kind of jerks about it. So we do obviously still inject critique into it. There's like a section of the video that's saying like, okay, so it's real-time ray tracing. It can't just be a magic bullet. What are the catches? And then I go through all the catches and things like that. So, you know, it's the really big part of that video beyond kind of the ability to do the exclusive part was getting the behind the scenes access to get an understanding from the developer point of view of what it means to them to light the game fully with ray tracing now. And there, all I did was I asked, okay, could you please send me a video of your old workflow in a variety of scenes and then the new workflow alongside of it. And in each video, it was the exact same thing. The artist placing all these lights, adjusting them manually, then creating like the point lights, the fill lights as they're called, to fill up the scene with lighting, and spending all this time. And they were doing it just for the purpose of the video. So it would actually probably take a lot longer than what I show in the video, by the way, because they would try and do it to a more perfect degree. And the ray tracing difference there for them, from the artist, the lighting artist perspective, is essentially not having any of these fill lights at all, making sure the lights are marked up so that they're actually counted as a part of ray tracing, and then essentially clicking a button that makes sure that they're enabled in the ray tracing view of the game. And that's really about it. And that's huge. It's not only, like John was saying, we're reaping the benefits of a game fully lit by ray tracing and seeing what it looks like visually, but for the developer artist perspective, this is saving them tons of time while also giving them kind of like this systemic, environment where lighting makes sense with a lot less guessing.
I love the fact that it's almost turning game lighting into something that's more like lighting a film set, or, you know, where you actually have to take into consideration the nature of light, like what happens when you put a light next to certain materials or in certain places. The way that might traditionally behave in a game is not the way light really works, and this comes much closer to actually simulating real light, which is this is why I think it's going to be really fascinating to see, because we're basically moving towards leaving a lot of those tricks behind and just relying on like an actual simulation now. And yeah, this is a great first step for that.
I think I've got a lot of questions about this, Alex, and I was reading the discourse on our Discord last night, and I think a lot of our supporters have got a lot of questions about this as well. But I think, first of all, a statement. This is the new 4A engine, basically. So the next 4A game, I mean, at the moment with Metro Exodus, if you haven't got a ray tracing GPU, you just fall back to the old Metro Exodus. That's there, it's not going away. The new game, there will be no fallback. I mean, it's probably a few years off,
Yeah.
But the point is, this is the new 4A engine. So that's it. That's it for rasterization as far as 4A games are
They're
concerned,
done.
to the best of our knowledge. Yeah, and
This is amazing.
And it's important to stress they're the first, but they're certainly not going to be the last. But I guess the questions I was picking up on, I mean, people were blown away by it, quite rightly. Now, the question was, can a console run this? Because obviously we've got the Enhanced Edition coming on Series consoles and PlayStation 5. But, we saw some phenomenal visuals there. Are these consoles up to it?
Totally. I mean, we've already looked in other videos in the past, kind of examining the AMD versus NVIDIA kind of difference, I would say, in their ray tracing performance. And, obviously we found out for incoherent rays, it's 2 to 4 times slower, depending upon what you're doing. But the whole point is that even with the AMD hardware being slower, that's also found in consoles, they are just bigger GPUs in general. This is already running on an RTX 2060. If you turn it down to normal settings, high tessellation, you're getting 1080p 60 for a lot of the experience. Couple that internal 1080p resolution with something like temporal anti-aliasing upsampling, then you essentially are going to have a visual experience that is very compelling. On the console side, you're going to have ray tracing performance that is better than an RTX 2060, of course, probably 2060 Super-ish, a little bit higher, maybe a little bit lower, depending upon what's going on. But then all this extra rasterization performance helping out. It's totally doable. I would imagine they're probably going to end up using the normal ray tracing setting there, which is quarter resolution of the internal resolution for the ray tracing, for all the bounce light and everything like that. And then they've already kind of said it. They're going to be using temporal anti-aliasing upsampling, reconstruction to get a 4K image targeting 60 FPS. And I imagine there's DRS in there too, so it'll probably float a bit. But yes, in spite of everything, the video was captured on an incredibly high-end PC, like RTX 3090, 10900K, totally boss system. Yeah. But it, as I showed in the video, the higher the output or the higher internal resolution is, the better this kind of lower end RT modes look. And consoles will be sitting down there in the lower end, but it still looks really compelling. You're not missing out on anything. And yeah, consoles totally.
They're also targeting 60 frames per second, aren't they?
Yeah, that's the interesting part. So there's a lot to talk about there because some of the environments in the game are way heavier than the others.
Yeah.
So if you go on I showed it once in the video on the taiga map, which is this outdoor section with all these kind of trees and things like that. There's indoor sections of the taiga map where you're in these little huts, and light can go inside the hut and then go outside again through tiny little openings. This is terrible for ray tracing hardware, by the way. It's the worst thing you can do. And there, the GPU utilization skyrockets, the 3090 is baking inside the PC. I really do wonder how the dynamic resolution will cope on something like a console game in something like that instance. If it will start dropping really, really low. We'll just have to wait and see. But I think 60 FPS is doable primarily on the GPU side. CPU's interesting because I did find once again that the 3600 in the new version, that is the Ryzen 3600, was rather CPU limited given what's happening on screen at times.
The game seems pretty CPU heavy at points. I've found that's definitely where I've been bottlenecked in the past as well. I mean, this is the new engine. I haven't tried it yet, but the 4A stuff, it does put a heavy load on your CPU.
Yeah, and ray tracing makes that even heavier. So I just can't wait to get my hands on it and kind of tear it apart, see what they're doing to get it running, see where the bottlenecks are, see where they aren't. But I definitely think, based upon everything I've seen already from this enhanced edition on PC, on a really low-end PC, the lowest one you can get really for ray tracing GPU performance, RTX 2060 there, totally doable on consoles, and it's probably going to be pretty awesome.
Cool.
I guess another interesting aspect that I didn't mention in the video necessarily, and we haven't really put it out there yet, is that we also have a variety of interviews. Well, I have 2 right now. Technically, I have one interview with Ben Archard and Oles, who's unfortunately his family name I can always not pronounce very correctly, so I don't want to say it and embarrass myself. But essentially the kind of CTO tech lead of 4A Games. going into the depths of what the ray tracing implementation is, how it works now in comparison to how it used to work, what some of the limitations are, what some of the strengths are, all these kind of things that I think a lot of hardcore tech nerds are really going to want to be reading, and that should be coming out in the future, as well as I just the other day received back some answers to questions that I sent off to their executive producer, John Bloch, and kind of, this is more, it's still very technical, but it's asking questions about the effect on game development and some other very 4A specific questions. But there's more coming out as a result of this exclusive thing that we did with Metro here, and you'll see it on the Eurogameware website in the future.
I love this, Alex, because I can feel your love for 4A and Metro stuff. It's pretty much, and it makes sense because I think Metro 2033 was like the next Crisis at the time in a way. Like, very different looking game, but when that first shipped, it was kind of the next benchmark in PC graphics. And I want to say really that your video on this was exceptionally well done. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thanks, John.
Agreed.
So,
Thanks,
tremendous job,
thanks.
dude.
Yeah, thanks.
Good stuff, yeah. And I can only just say that video, that was just phenomenal. I mean, it took a long time, but the effort was hugely worth it. And it was just awesome for me to kind of help enable that.
Yeah.
It's just awesome stuff. Okay, well, let's move on. This one's for you, Tom. It's
good.
Mortal Shell, the game that won't go away. It's the game that's kind of like Outriders, except we do cover it.
Nobody's saying where's Mortal Shell, but Tom is like, here's Mortal Shell.
Well, it's a fascinating project, and just to stress, we will get around to Outriders, and we will explain why we've been delaying it when we do the coverage. But anyway, the point is, Mortal Shell, PlayStation 5. There's a whole history of weirdness surrounding this, but it finally looks as though it has been resolved. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it's been a weird up and down roller coaster for this one, and for it's odd that we get so invested in a game like this isn't a massive scale game, but it's like the developer clearly cares a lot about it and making sure it runs well. So the history is it ran with issues when it first launched on PS5 and Series X. Then they added a patch which made it seemingly worse on PS5 and just absolutely ruined the 60 FPS playback. It had, it was pretty much in the broadly the right place when it first arrived on PS5, but they took it a massive step back to make it run at the same resolution as Series X, 1800p. And we were just a bit, head in hands at that point. I remember John and I were talking about it, just saying this is the wrong direction to take your game.
Don't do it.
But it wasn't actually the same resolution, because 1800p dynamic on Series X, and it was 1800p locked for some mysterious reason on PlayStation 5, and it seemed to make a huge impact to it. Now, the new patch essentially brings it into line with Series X, right? So it's 1800p dynamic, and performance is hugely improved.
Yeah, I've given us some footage to run on this, but it's we've got a side by side between PS5 and Series X, and it's they've given DRS to both sides, and they both run at 1800p dynamic, and PS5 is still a little bit behind. Like, I think that's just the main highlight, really. You've got that sort of chamber at the end of this long dungeon, which suddenly dips into the 50s on PS5 and not on Series X. But that's fine. I think that's still it's just fine. So if you really, really are invested in Mortal, we call it
Shell.
We call it Mortal.
You call it Mortal Coil for some reason.
Mortal Coil.
It's just a Shakespearean thing.
Yeah.
You'd be amazed how many times the script comes up with Mortal Shell
Tom,
and Mortal Coil.
if this game is not your game of the year for 2021, I'm going to be disappointed.
Well, look, let's just quickly talk about the game here, because we've got so obsessed with frame rates and image quality and 1440p, 1800p dynamic, blah, 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 blah. Is it actually a good game?
It's a good take on the Dark Souls formula. Yeah, like it's clearly like the team have a passion for that style, that Dark Souls style, and they thought, what if we put a twist on it? I don't think it nails the combat mechanics as tightly as From Software's games. So that is a major failing, I feel, when you come into this.
Yeah. So the twist is the mortal shell, right? That's literally the twist, right? You have like a shield, right? Am I mistaken? Yeah.
Well, you've always had a shield in Dark Souls.
Well, no. Like a little shell of your character.
You basically become like a statue.
Yeah, right. Isn't that it?
Deflect damage.
That's it.
Yeah. Okay.
And a good timed use of it at any point during a move, you can then, avoid damage and then carry on with your attack.
Okay. Right.
So it's a neat idea, and there's a lot of stuff in there which kind of just plays with, varies on the formula Dark Souls laid out. Items, they slowly drip feed you health once you use them, and there's still a great air of mystery to it. The aesthetic is slightly more gothic, and I think people might get a kick out of that. It's a good sort of visual design.
I was actually kind of impressed with it. I have to admit, you had me captured for that one video, and it's a cool game. It has a bit of a learning curve for sure with that mortal shell system, but I see the appeal.
Yeah. Yeah, weirdly, the nearest touchstone I can think of in terms of the visual aesthetic is remember that Monty Python sketch with the knights who say "ni."
Yeah,
oh yes,
it's like that forest.
Who could forget
the black forests, the misty forests, and the tall helmets. And
it's exactly.
Bring me a shrubbery.
I hope they make a special appearance somewhere in there.
They probably do.
But this is phenomenal.
Except for they are no longer the knights who say "ni," so we have to keep that in
mind. I think another interesting thing about Mortal Shell is, and it probably won't ever be covered now just due to what's happening. There's a lot of stuff that we also have to cover in the next period alongside doing Tech Focus and things like that, is the PC version of Mortal Shell is being updated, if it hasn't already, to have DLSS and ray tracing, and that's a very small team. And the only reason why that's possible is because, UE4 at this point in time, Unreal Engine 4 supports DLSS and ray tracing features very easily, just like plug-in kind of style. So it probably looks good, probably looks even better than what you can find on console, but I don't know if I'll ever even be able to check that out. Who knows?
Well, look, Mortal Shell is quickly becoming the game of DF Direct Weekly.
Oh, gosh.
We've got to keep the momentum going, Alex.
Yeah, that's
You're going to have to talk about it on here.
So maybe
the people must
load it up, give it a go. Tell us about the ray tracing.
Okay.
And just keep that momentum rolling. We need to know more. Nier Replicant.
Yes.
Yes.
So I haven't actually had time to take a look at this myself yet. We were going to cover it, but then the code came in late. Not sure whether we will cover it, but I'm looking at the docket here, and under notes it says played and super good, which sounds like John Linneman has something to say about it.
Yes. Nier Replicant version 1.22474487139. I started.
Well said.
I started playing it this week. It's really interesting thus far. So first of all, I've played a lot of these games going back, the Yoko Taro games going back to the original Dragoon or whatever it was called in the West, I guess. Drakengard, that's right.
Yeah,
from Kavia. Yeah. And I do have and played the original Nier back on PlayStation 3, and it's really cool. But I felt that mechanically Nier Automata, by seeking out the help from Platinum Games, that made a huge difference in terms of the action. Well, Nier Replicant is basically a remake of the 2010, I think it was, version, the original PS3 and 360 game, but it feels so much more polished and just nice to play somehow. It's basically it doesn't look like a next gen game necessarily, and it's not. It's a last gen game with backwards compatibility on the new machines, but it's been updated to run at full 60 frames per second, higher resolution. They seem to have implemented the GI solution from Nier Automata. Maybe I actually don't know if it's the same engine though, but because that was the Platinum engine. But it does they actually use this really well. There's a lot of this high contrast scenery with like light pouring in and striking the stone, the sand, and other materials, and sort of bouncing around in a way that looks really cool. Because just like the original, the art style is very monochromatic. That's kind of part of the look. But this new pass on the lighting is really awesome. And I also love the run cycle in this game. I enjoyed Dad Nier, by the way. They switched the characters around, because in the original Japanese version, you had one protagonist, the brother, and in the US version, or in the Western version, you actually played as the father. And it was like, this time it's I guess everybody, it's been centralized. But there's something about the run cycle. This is something that really sticks out to me, where just the connection with there's this kinetic energy towards running around the world that feels so good. And it really made me realize just how important it is to get those nuts and bolts right. I love the way it feels.
So in terms of combat, though, is it sticking to the original Nier, or is it going automata?
Oh yeah, I mean it's much more. It feels better than the original Nier, and it has a lot of. But it feels like a pretty. It hasn't evolved significantly, but it has definitely improved. I actually haven't gone back to the original Nier since I originally played it, so I kind of want to pop it in again and just refresh my memory on how it feels, because it feels great now. And I will also say I'm playing on the Xbox Series X version, because that's the version we got in to check out, and loading times are super quick on there. And there's loading times between the different zones. So it's usually about 5 or 6 seconds, and the frame rate is completely 100% locked on that system. I'd be curious to see what it's like on the last gen consoles, but unlike Nier Automata in its original form, there are none of those weird micro hitches or any sort of issues with the general performance. It's just completely 100% stable, and it feels really nice to play as a result. So yeah, it's like they took that original game and they polished it up. It doesn't feel like a new game, but it feels so much more refined than before in a way that I'm really enjoying. And like I said, I want to go back and pop in the PS3 original again, just to refresh my memory on how it's changed. But I like it so far. It's definitely something I think I will play through.
So I guess my question, John, a lot of people would have jumped on the franchise with Automata. If they played that, enjoyed it, do you think they're going to enjoy playing the original game with this remaster?
Definitely.
Or is it just very different?
Oh no, it's they share a lot of elements. I think that what's interesting about the original Nier, though, is that it kind of it plays with expectations in an interesting way, and this is what made it impactful in the day, where like the first however many hours you play the game, it feels very rote in a way. You're kind of running around, you're doing some fetch quests, and you're thinking this is just kind of a standard RPG-ish thing, but then it turns everything on its head, and it really goes in some interesting directions. And obviously Automata built upon those elements, but I think if you enjoyed that game, it's definitely worth going back to experience this one, because it's been polished up so nicely now, and the story stuff is fantastic as usual. So definitely recommend it.
Well, let's move on, and we're going to be talking about GameStack. We discussed it in part last week, and there's a couple of presentations that you want to pick up on, I think, Alex.
Yeah, I guess the first one I want to mention is the DirectStorage on PC. These are all, by the way, I do recommend if you're interested in them. There's the Microsoft game developer GameStack YouTube channel. These are all really easily accessible, and I will only give essentially short summaries of like what's interesting from the gamer perspective on them. And if you're actually more interested, please do watch the actually original videos. But the DirectStorage on PC presentation was very interesting because it gave a higher level understanding of what DirectStorage means for PC. DirectStorage is essentially as a part of the Xbox Velocity architecture. It's a remake of the Windows I/O or storage kind of software stack.
Something we've definitely needed.
Yeah, it's really old at this point in time.
Yeah.
I mean, it's for legacy reasons. And that has problems for taking advantage of what SSDs can do, as in like you don't just need like serialized grabs off of a hard disk platter with an SSD. You can grab many multiple files really quickly with instant access at once on an SSD. And the Windows I/O storage stack really can't take advantage of this. So it's about first that software side, making sure that like multiple parallelized, device reads can be done really quickly. And then also the kind of decompression aspect of it is very different on PC, because on PC you have system memory, you have video memory, and to essentially get things off the hard disk into video memory requires a kind of trip into system memory and then like a kind of response from the CPU to get things from system memory then onto the GPU. It's a roundabout thing, and that's just the way PCs have been built and worked for ages. It has its advantages and its disadvantages. But this is kind of about getting rid of the middleman situation where the kind of CPU is dominating the ability for the GPU to grab things off of the hard drive. So it has essentially now a trip where it goes from the hard drive and shuffles into system memory, but then shuffles immediately into VRAM. And this is essentially giving the console-like experience of grabbing things from the hard drive into VRAM now. Another part of this to make it more worthwhile is not just grabbing things from the hard drive, but also grabbing them in a compressed state, not like compressed textures, but like a compression shell or block around all this data, much like you would see on like Kraken or BC Pack on the Microsoft side, and then decompressing that into the GPU to multiply the kind of essential bandwidth that you're getting so you could have like larger textures or more data, or just use less bandwidth while doing that. The way it works on the console side for both PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X and S is there's a hardware decompression block where they kind of, to save essentially cycles on the GPU or CPU, make a custom little unit that is really small, and all it does is decompress stuff in very specific formats. On this PC side, GPUs and motherboards and CPUs don't have this because they're kind of generalized designs. So Microsoft has written a OpenCL, or essentially GPU compute decompressor that works on the GPU. So the GPU takes a little bit of its power and uses that for decompressing data off the disk as it goes and flies through system RAM into VRAM. And this is pretty awesome. It's taking advantage of the kind of like the open nature of PC hardware. It's pretty hard to expect developers to already have like hardware decompression units on GPUs or something like that. And it won't take up a lot of GPU time, and it saves a ton of CPU time, which is really great. And the interesting thing about this model that Microsoft's developing, and it still is going to be advancing in the future, there's a couple hints in this presentation that they're looking at a way of getting even rid of the aspect of the slight little moment when it enters system RAM. They're looking at kind of working around that in the future, and also the OpenCL kind of decompression software they've written that runs on the GPU. It's mappable to hardware in the future. So should NVIDIA, Intel, or AMD want to include hardware decompression units on their GPUs, this OpenCL thing would just map to it rather perfectly. So it's a lot of info. It's still semi-early stages. I think developer previews for it start in the summer of 2021, so a couple months from now. But it'll be a pretty big change in this hardware kind of space on PC, and will give us those sweet, access times and load times that we want to see to take advantage of the hardware. Because right now, if you have a 7 gigabytes per second SSD on PC, well, it's not doing too much actually.
Yeah, fair enough.
Oh,
and did you cover off the sample of feedback streaming presentation?
Sorry, I'm just talking so much. Sample of feedback streaming. This is another thing. This applies both to Xbox and PC again. It's supported on NVIDIA's Turing and Ampere and above, as well as RDNA 2. And this is essentially the ability for the graphics card in its shaders to have a better understanding of which parts of a texture need to be loaded into the scene. That's essentially it. And as a result of that, there's a less guessing by game developers when they set up a texture cache. And it rolls in and out in real time. So it's always constantly rolling in new textures. And then shortly thereafter, there's this like buffer period where it rolls them back out again as it realizes that it doesn't need them, like older ones. The reason why this is such a good thing is because even though you may have like, let's say something like a 2.5 gigabytes per second NVMe drive, instead of just always constantly using that and filling it with textures that are not necessarily even viewed on screen, this is a big deal. This happens actually really often in games. It's only filling them with what they need. So you can have much, much higher resolution textures and not have to worry about going over budget. And actually, you're decreasing the budget by quite a lot. The numbers they were showing off for a very simple test scene with, I would say, not even the most intense kind of materials you could probably have were just great. And it'll only be better when it's in the hands of real developers. And I guess from the console comparison perspective, sampler feedback streaming, this kind of multiplier for hardware texture memory, is interesting because Xbox Series X, of course, as we know, or Xbox Series S has like a smaller bandwidth on its SSD speed in comparison to the PlayStation 5. Well, it doesn't actually need to be a big disadvantage with something like sampler feedback streaming in place because it's not going to be wasting, I would say, precious bandwidth cycling in new textures that it may not even be displaying anyway. So it's just really cool tech. And the only problem with it is that I would say is that it requires developer pickup, which is another part of this presentation is essentially Microsoft trying to pitch to developers, please take advantage of these great software things we're giving to you. And so it will have a pickup time. It's not something that just the hardware does by itself. It needs developers to code against it. And as a result of that, it may take a little bit before we see it in games. I think we're going to see it immediately, though, in something like Halo Infinite or any of the Microsoft titles. Yeah.
Yeah, I think on a general level, Microsoft have got a bit of a challenge on their hands because obviously there are hardware features that Series X has that PlayStation 5 doesn't have. And PlayStation 5, if we assume that that's kind of like the baseline, almost like the critical mass of the market, why should developers embrace these features if they're not going to get any return from them from the PlayStation 5? So it's a bit of a challenge for Microsoft to evangelize that and to get take-up, I think. And it's the same with the other features that the Series X has. Right, Alex, you've done a lot of talking, but I'm going to give you a break. Tom, you've been looking at Genshin Impact, PlayStation 5. Tell us more.
It's an interesting one. We've kind of missed this since it released late last year. We sort of saw it as a free-to-play game, very anime-focused, and it was on PS4 and Pro, and we had so much more pertinent things to get to, I guess, at that time. So they've released a proper PlayStation 5 app for it this week, and it gave us a good reason to just jump back in and see what exactly this game is about. It's from developer MuHoYo, and it's very much free to play, and yeah, it's Unity based in terms of the engine, which I think I don't know. My impression of the engine so far is it's certainly got issues. If it's not handled, properly sometimes, like with frame rates. If there's certainly some difficult cases, especially when it comes to Switch conversions or with Unity. But I did have hope going into this one because PS4 and Pro run at 30 FPS as the target, but they just didn't do it.
No, it wasn't smooth at all. I was kind of shocked at the performance, to be honest.
Yeah, given the game's visuals. Yeah, same.
And then the other surprise was they did add a soft backwards compatibility, backcompat Lite to the game for PS5 till this week to give it 60 FPS, and it was just like still quite a bad idea. It just didn't do 60. It was like between numbers, but so this PS5 proper update brings in full 4K support, better textures, better loading times, and a few other bits and pieces. But I can say, like, without spoiling too much of the video, like, it's the frame rate side of things is just woeful. I was just like, the further I get into that game, the more I realize how bad this is.
Even in the native PS5 version, it's still that bad.
Even in the native PS5 version, it was so bad. I literally, you know how you sometimes can boot up the wrong version of the game because of the way the PS5 front end is structured. You can just start it and you're like, oh, actually I'm in PS4. Let's go back out and swap to the PS5 app. No, I was just in the PS5 app. It's just, I couldn't believe it. But yeah, it's an interesting game. Very, very sort of charming. It's got that anime aesthetic, which it's a bit Marmite, I guess, depending on where you fall on that. But
well, I guess my question for you, Tom, is if it's still got the backcompat plus support on PS4, should you use the PS4 version of the app, or should you use the PS5 one?
So this is something I'm digging into. I don't know the answer. Something I'm going to find out today. But there is a case for that because of the enhancements they gave PS5. It could be very interesting. So I'll find out today, and we'll see in the final analysis. Which,
Okay,
good stuff. Well, let's move on. Alex, you're back. Sorry.
It's okay. I want to talk about this anyway.
I'm going to demand more words from you. And we're going to be talking about Returnal, Housemarque's PlayStation 5 debut. Fascinating release. Tell us more.
Yeah, I guess it's a little different because this is a console exclusive title on PlayStation 5, so it's not something I'd usually cover. But John and Tom indisposed for a variety of reasons, and I'm covering it. And it turns out to be just a surprisingly delightful game. From a tech perspective, it's very interesting because it's UE4, and Housemarque usually in the past, other than their kind of multiplayer game they made most recently, was always custom tech.
Yep.
But they throw in their own little stylistic design into this tech here with it using a lot of particle effects, where I do wonder if they're using the standard particle system of UE4, and I almost think they're not at this point in time, given how extensive it is. So it is very interesting visually. The game design is also top tier. It does, I would say, it's a lot more interesting than most AAA titles for me, because it's telling its story through its gameplay, and it does it very well. And it's just generally good fun. It's a little hard though, so it's not necessarily for everyone. But as a part of this, it's also an interesting data point for the future of when we talk about image quality, because I know a lot of people will probably have seen the video by the time this comes out to our non-Patreon backers or just to the general audience, and they'll have seen that when doing pixel counting and looking at the image quality of the game, it does suffer. It is kind of advertised as, I believe, dynamic 4K, and it is obviously outputting a real 4K image in the aspect that it is actually 4K pixels, but the internal resolution is being upsampled through reconstruction, looks to actually be 1080p. And obviously, this is interesting just from my perspective, as we can have a 1080p DLSS image being upsampled to 4K, and it looks really, really good. But if you take normal TAAU, like what Unreal Engine 4 has, and you do that same thing, it's less successful. So there are there are enough visual artifacts in the game due to this being a thing. But in the end, people are going to probably be focusing a lot on that, which is a little bit of a shame. It's a shame, but
I think we discussed in that video is that Housemarque made all the right decisions here. It's a beautiful 60 frames per second game with unbelievable amount of particles on screen and just this gorgeous art direction. It's very Prometheus inspired, but with a lot of other elements as well. Like, I was really kind of stunned by how it looks in motion, to the point where, that image quality issue, I don't really think it's a huge issue when you're just playing the game.
Well, it's also, targeting 60 FPS and doing a rather fine job at it. And that's the whole point.
It's very stable,
in the end. And this is unsurprising, though, because, in the end, if a game is doing a very expensive visual effects, resolution always has to suffer. There's no free lunch. Either you're paying it in hardware, or you're paying it in pixels, or you're paying it in frame rate. So they're doing a lot of crazy stuff with the particles, and apparently this one's a little bit harder to put my finger on. The PlayStation 4 or PlayStation blog did mention ray trace lighting in the game. I can't find really direct evidence for it. It can be something like RTAO. It could also technically be something like RTXGI, which, to describe that really quickly, it's essentially like the game already uses like what typical rasterized probe lighting for its global illumination, but then ray tracing is done at a fixed level, and it just makes sure that the probes are not leaking light everywhere. It could be doing that too, but that's like a level of ray tracing that is not very user visible. So if a game's already doing expensive things like that, this resolution setup makes quite a bit of sense on a hardware like the PlayStation 5. Other than that, it's just a wonderful game, little to no loading, and just quality.
Yeah, this could be one of the best things Housemarque's ever done in the end. And I really hope that this does well for them, because you can really feel a lot of love poured into this project. It's also interesting that it comes from Finland, like Remedy. So you play this, you play Control, and you're like, what's going on over there?
Yeah, Housemarque is excellent. Just being there for around a console launch. We've had Stardust, we've had Resogun, and it does feel like they always like push the envelope right at the start of a console generation, just for filling that screen with particles and just energy.
You're right, Tom. But what's interesting here is just how much more vast and I guess their traditional games have been arcade style games, and I love those games. And we were actually a little bit concerned when they had announced that they have to move away from that. But what they've done here is create something that still offers some of what they had delivered previously with their arcade style games, but offers it in a very different package. And it's very it's interesting. I mean, it's a roguelike, but it feels much more persistent, handcrafted.
It does feel more persistent.
It's not just like you're redoing the same thing all the time. And the way they integrate those elements into the storytelling is also really, really creative and cool.
Yeah, another thing that I do wonder, because I was playing on PlayStation 5, and it is UE4, and I do wonder, as part of the kind of push for more PC ports, whether or not this is on the docket in the future at some point in time, due to being UE4. That'd be interesting to see if that ends up happening.
It wouldn't surprise me, but I guess my question for you, Alex, and indeed John, Housemarque, I mean, their technical chops, on another level. It goes all the way back to the demo scene.
Oh yeah,
decades ago. But they've actually embraced Unreal Engine 4 for this one. Was it the right move?
From my perspective, yes. It probably helped them prototype the game and get it out at all in the first place. And also,
it's difficult to compete with Unreal Engine these days, right? Like the amount of like staff you need and just knowledge to build up something comparable like that is not insignificant. And even though they had used their in-house technology for decades, the scale of this game is beyond anything they've ever made before. And I could imagine that knowing how they had struggled with some of their most recent games in terms of sales, like Nex Machina, which is incredible, but it didn't sell that well from what I understand. I'm not sure that they could have invested the amount of money necessary to bring their in-house technology up to the point where they could create a game like this.
There's a really good blog from Alex Tardif, who is a really great graphics programmer, and it was kind of about the inevitability of Unreal. And it is actually a very thoughtful essay about what it means to use middleware and things like that. And it is a very hard decision for a developer of the size like Housemarque, where, okay, so you have this great Housemarque in-house tech that does, Ray March, SDF voxels, explosions with tons of particles everywhere, but can it make a third-person game? Maybe. Can it do character animation like that? I don't know. Unreal already has all these things done. It's maybe less efficient and you have to adapt your workflow for it, but at the same time, it's already there.
Exactly.
So it's a very different investment of your working hours. It's a hard decision. I think in the end, it's pretty successful here, especially considering the way the game turned out in the end. I think, yeah, it was probably the right choice.
I think from my perspective, we've reached the point now where Epic have got, how can I describe it, a brain trust of talent in the graphics rendering space that is absolutely phenomenal. And to actually turn your back on that and go your own route, to produce your own technology that can compete with that is actually a really difficult decision to make. And I salute anybody who does decide to actually, produce their own game engine, because, what Epic are producing these days and just the sort of buying power they have for talent. And in actual fact, I was speaking to a technical director a while back who was finding it really difficult to hire because essentially Epic and Unity, they can make top level pitches to all of the best graphics talent. So it's actually quite difficult for them, and this is a AAA top tier developer responsible for one of the biggest games, having difficulties finding great tech staff because the deals that Epic and Unity can offer are just so immense. So I'm kind of heartened by what you're saying about Returnal. I haven't had the chance to play it yet. I'm heartened by it because it sounds to me like it's the right call. Housemarque have basically been able to tap into this state-of-the-art renderer, but at the same time, they've managed to put their own mark on it. They've managed to add their own layer. Still very much a Housemarque game by the look of it. So, I guess the only other question, and I hesitate to bring it up, but everybody is talking about it, is the concept that it's £70. It's like a hugely expensive game. What do you make of the value proposition?
Man.
John, what do you reckon?
Yeah, this is definitely a game worth full price, but it's not so. This isn't really about Returnal. This is about this push to the higher price bracket for all new games. Like, I could say 70 USD, which is I think what they charge for it in the US. That's not unreasonable. But the European and UK prices and Australian prices, I think the Australian price is over 100 USD. If you convert that, and it's like 80 euros here. Like it is. Let's put it this way. I was somebody that when I really liked a game like this, I would go out and buy the game straight away. Even if we got review code, I often went out and bought my own physical copy of it in the case that I really liked the game. I haven't been doing that lately because I just can't afford to do that with these new games right now. I will eventually add them to my collection, no doubt, when the price drops, but these new releases are just too darn expensive right now. I think, and I fear that this could create problems as well, because the very biggest games, will continue to get those sales no matter what. I'm not worried about that, but I am a little bit worried about the slightly less big games that are being released for this price point, and people being like, I can't really justify that. And then they end up selling worse than they might have at a lower price point. So it's really difficult to say how this is going to go for them. I mean, we've seen expensive stuff before, like the N64 era. New games then, due in part to the cartridge cost, they were pretty much like at this price level. That's kind of what you were paying for a lot of those new games at the time.
Turok.
But nobody. So I mean, I get it. Budgets are going up. It's an expensive time, but it's almost like got to read the room, like with what's been going on in the world lately and everything, and the state of things. And I don't know. It feels like the wrong time for this increase. And my fear is that this is going to drive the success of services, which I want them. I want there to be physical game releases still, but it is starting to get too expensive. And then you have all these services coming out, and it's just like, is this going to be the nail in the coffin? I'm a little bit worried about that.
So in your theoretical scenario where you're not worried about like large, massive AAA Call of Duties releasing games at plus 70 euros or 80, but then if that level of price is still used for like the AA or single A or whatever developer like Housemarque here, that they'll see their sales pushed lower due to the fact that they're competing with these large titles. And also people are just going to be apprehensive about giving out so much money. That's where you did say like it does make you worried about games service offerings as a competitor. My gosh, English. But Games Pass in this scenario is actually would be really good for something like Returnal in the aspect that it would give them a steady, hopefully, depending on the way the model works.
Let me clarify that.
Input.
It is good that these services allow more people to experience games. I'm not denying that. I just don't want this to kill the retail market as well.
For sure.
That's my only concern. But you're right. For this game, it is concerning, something like Returnal, because it is so unique and different. I hope the takeaway, if it doesn't meet sales expectation, isn't, oh, I guess we can't do weird and different things. We better make open world game 21.
It's, by the way, really different than most of Sony's offering in the past couple of years.
Yeah,
it's really good.
This
really
feels
cool.
like classic PlayStation to me in a way that I hope we see more of, but I don't know. So I hope it succeeds for them.
Absolutely, and it kind of comes hot on the heels of our discussion last week or the week before, where we were talking about Sony seemingly doubling down on their franchises, their existing franchises, and not experimenting on titles. So
this game succeeding is, I think, weirdly important to the console in a way, and just the future of PlayStation. Not to put too much on their shoulders, but games like this, they really need to do well, and I hope it does. In this case, I will actually shell out for a copy straight away, because I do want to support this game. But a lot of the other big stuff coming up, I can wait.
Okay, so let's move on to, I guess, our final section. We're going to be talking about Patreon Q&A. It's been a really successful part of the Digital Foundry Supporter Program. Get some fantastic questions coming in.
I love this part.
And the first question from Oliver Mackenzie, which I guess is aimed at me, about 10 years ago. Wow, we're going back here. Richard used to talk about the concept of a perceptual 60 frames per second, the idea that in a 60 FPS game, brief drops to somewhat lower frame rates will often not be noticeable. Do I still think about that? I don't really talk about that anymore because, firstly, the question of perception changes from person to person. So, something that I don't notice, John might notice.
Definitely.
But in terms of the question here, we were talking about Call of Duty. So Call of Duty, it's a series where typically they would allow frame rate to drop from 60 in cutscenes. And when you've got shaky camera and, cutscenes and stuff, the drops are less noticeable and they are probably not going to be picked up on by most people. But at the same time, you can have, and this is kind of like the classic example where I think it was Mario Kart on the Wii U, which ran at 59 frames per second. And we picked that up at the time. Once you see it, you can't unsee it because of the nature of the content, always in motion, a lot of lateral left-right motion. So this is actually something where, losing 1 frame per second shouldn't make any kind of difference at all. Most people probably didn't perceive it. But once you see it, once you're locked onto it, you can't really unsee it.
Yeah.
What do you reckon about all of this, John?
See, this is a really interesting topic. And this really ties in. When we give the frame rate data, I often look at the conversations around it. And I really think it's extremely critical to interpret it in a way where you can understand where and why drops are occurring, how frequent. Because, let's say a game occasionally will drop to 50 frames per second. We'll say it's a 60 FPS game. During big explosions or something, you get these drops to how about all the way down to 40, and it's whoa, that's a huge drop. But then you have another game that runs at pretty much a consistent 57 to 58 FPS, 90% of the time, rarely actually getting all the way to the 60. the game that drops all the way to 40 but is usually 60 is going to look infinitely better to my eyes. And so people would look at the graph, they'll take a screenshot of the lowest part and they'll say, look how bad this is. And then this other one they'll show that's like averaging 57 all the time. This one's way better. But in reality, that's not the case. And that's just an example of how important it is to understand the context around frame rate. But the thing is, though, is as Richard said, this is something, the perception of frame rate is going to vary from person to person. I'm really possibly overly sensitive to it, but it's how frequent it occurs and in what the context that it occurs in that really matters. Like you said, that 59 FPS thing in Mario Kart 8 on the Wii, that drove me nuts. I hated it. It looked awful.
I hate it too, man.
It's just this constant tick that feels wrong. Or, you play like a 2D platform game and you're getting these weird like things, and this also gets into the whole incorrect frame pacing thing where you're actually hitting 30 FPS all the time, but the frame persistence is off. So, and a lot of times in old school games, and where the term slowdown came from, especially in like shooters, is they would actually continue to draw every frame and the game would just run at a slower speed temporarily. And in those cases, I actually think that looks pretty good compared to like frame skipping. It can be, as long as it doesn't happen too often, it doesn't really impact the fluidity. But weird issues with frame skipping or like, regularly failing to hit the target, that stuff tends to be the most important for me. So, yeah. Mm-hmm. I could go on and on about this, but I should stop.
I don't know. I kind of get a weird kick out of seeing, once there's explosions flying, in that case where you mentioned that there is an instance in a perfectly 60 game otherwise that it'll drop when you let loose on the explosions and the firepower. That's kind of fun to watch sometimes.
Sometimes it's almost intentional. Like I think in Border Down on the Dreamcast, every time you finish off a boss, or also Ikaruga, they like flood the screen with alpha particles, so there's tons of overdraw, and it just tanks the frame rate for about 5 seconds. So you get this like epic feeling of like, man, everything's blowing up. But there could be other, like that actually takes me back to when I first played Deus Ex in the year 2000 on my machine. It was very heavy on the hard drive, and every time I would trigger an explosion, you get the hard drive access, the whole game would seize up momentarily, and then the explosion would be finished. And I used to think, man, that explosion must be so cool, because
there's a couple of games which weave it into the game design. Like, do you remember Bangai-O on, I think, DS? Certainly DS had that.
There's N64, Dreamcast was the first one, those two, and then they did a DS game, which was a different one.
Yeah. The DS one, which was remarkable, because I think it takes up like 2 megabytes or something. When that frame, it's intentionally meant to drop the frame rate so you can navigate these areas.
I mean, that gets into that whole thing with that awesome dude who's doing the Super NES hacks, where he's implementing SA1 support into games that had a ton of slowdown. Like his first project was Gradius 3, and the initial release, it removed all slowdown, so it was completely locked 60 FPS, but that game, it suddenly becomes almost impossible to play because some of those scenes are so dense and difficult to navigate that at full speed you can barely handle it. So he actually did an update that maintains the smooth frame rate, but actually takes some of that into account and makes it more playable. So it is a curious
sometimes. Thing. Be careful what you wish for sometimes.
Exactly.
Well, I think where we can actually round this one off is the fact that, John, you're super sensitive to frame rate, but VRR is actually doing a lot of heavy lifting.
Oh, dude.
In terms of smoothing off the experience. And I think basically what you're noticing isn't really a drop to frame rate, it's a spike to frame time. And when that spike is smoothed out, when the frame persistence is actually in line with the actual load on the GPU, it's far less of an issue.
That's exactly why a completely consistent 30 frames per second can look okay to my eyes. It's that consistency in frame times, and that's the key, and that's exactly what VRR solves. Is it gets rid of the spikes and it just smooths it out, and it really is effective. I mean, games between the 50 and 60 FPS range especially, even I can barely tell that the frame rate is changing at all. It throws me for a loop. When I first looked at the Crysis Remastered updated patch, for instance, I was like, wow, this is a locked 60 in the 4K mode on Xbox. And then I actually switched off VRR for capture, and it was like, oh, okay.
Damn.
Let's move on then. Next question. I think it's a good one for Alex, since it's kind of almost related to what we were talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
This is from Glasgow Graham. Alex, what is it about alpha transparencies that has such an impact on performance?
Usually bandwidth sapping. That's what they tend to do. And there could be some other reasons why, depending upon how alpha is done. It can also be like pretty shading intensive too. And that's basically about it. Bandwidth has been kind of steadily going up over time, but I would say a little bit less than like shading power. So even nowadays, a game that throws a lot of transparency around will still tank the frame rate on big GPUs. And I think we're gonna maybe over time start seeing this less because alpha is like the reason why we even use alpha is because it's trying to represent dust and particles, or it's trying to represent leaves on a tree. Well, when in reality, those are actually little discrete things, like the little discrete particles themselves, or maybe leaves are on a tree are actually geometry.
That ties back into the origins of video games with like sprites. You always had that transparent color, so you can see through things. It's the only way to make those objects look smooth that don't have completely squared off surfaces.
Exactly, like that cyan color that they would usually use. And I think we'll be seeing a little bit less transparency overdraw, frame rate death explosions in games over time as we start moving over to non-alpha transparency-based effects work for certain things. We already saw it with Frust-on-the-Line voxel fog. Yep. That used to be always just like, there's billboards everywhere in the environment. Tons of Japanese games would always be like, here's all this fog. It's just like 6 billion billboards and it only runs on PS2. That's kind of like what used to be the thing, but then it changes over time. And I think we're going to see that too with foliage. Foliage in games, I think, is going to start maybe in the next 5 years, start being more actual geometry. And it'll look better too.
What's interesting to me, Alex, is like we have seen an example of a game console where the bandwidth was kind of over-spec'd compared to other elements of the system with like PlayStation 2, where it could throw around so many transparencies without issues because it just had so much bandwidth to spare. But it had other limitations in areas, which meant that never really became a bottleneck in most cases. So, that's why the Metal Gear Solid port was so interesting, or Silent Hill 2, because those games were designed for PlayStation 2. They used a ton of alpha transparencies, and the more powerful Xbox, they had to cut those effects way down because that was a more traditional, or I guess what would become a more traditional GPU approach, right? And that had a much greater cost. So, but obviously now, I think, like you say, what's key is like finding new ways to do these types, because it's not just, it doesn't have to be this way. There's different ways to sort of replicate the desired effect now, and the technology's there to like sort of pick and choose that. But I mean, fundamentally, transparency is it's always been a big issue. I mean, back in the day, it just came down to calculating like, okay, you got one object overlapping another object. You find a way to determine, don't draw the object behind it. But when something's transparent, it becomes more resource intensive to actually draw the transparent thing while also keeping in account that now there's an object behind it that also has to be drawn. And the more you layer that up, the heavier it gets. And it's just more math, basically.
Yeah, usually the way they deal with a heavy buildup of alpha these days is throwing DRS to kind of soften the blow.
Yeah.
And you can always see it.
Actually, it's funny, coming off the Quake video, I realized in its original form, Quake has like no alpha transparency as far as I can tell.
CPU baby. Yeah.
Like they don't even try. Like it's just like, nope, we're not doing anything like that.
There are some interesting things about alpha transparency overdraw. So one usage of VRS is variable rate shading, is to apply it to alpha on like either in the VRS tier 2 style where it's looking at the screen and saying this is perceptually not obvious, but also the way devs have been doing it forever is just always having like quarter or half resolution or eighth res,
dude,
there's
like an art to that though. And if you do if you art up your assets in just the right way, then doing quarter, eighth res actually can look pretty good. I think Killzone 2 is still a great example of this, where it looks awesome.
There's also a good blog article about using MSAA and like with alpha to make it look like they're not quarter or eighth res very easily by Matt Petneo, the person who worked at Rad or still works at Rad as their lead. That's a really good blog. I think it was also used in the order probably as a result because they used MSAA. And another, there are obviously like tools to essentially always make sure that you're when you overdraw tools.
When you said Rad, you meant Ready at Dawn. So
Ready at Dawn. I think not Rad tools.
I know. Yeah. I think most people when they see Rad, they think Rad tools, and they're like, "What?"
No. Not Rad tools. That's something else. That's another Epic family thing now, I guess. There's also like overdraw, because the reason why this happens often is because just I guess the artist setting up it shouldn't really be happening because it's actually not a very good thing to have. But like the artist just doesn't have an understanding of how much alpha is overlapping or something like that. So having a tool that just like marks out areas of the screen that are red, if there's a lot of overdraw there, is a good thing too. And I guess the last thing to say about alpha, since we're talking about it all now, is that the way it's usually done in games, it doesn't guarantee order independence. So that means when you see this all the time in games where there's like a sprite particle in front of all this stuff, and then all the other transparent objects behind it look like blackish colored or wrongly shaded, and you're like, that looks really weird. I just recently saw it in Metro Exodus, actually. This is still a problem nowadays, and there's not a really good way to do it on GPUs that is not super expensive. So I don't know. I feel like alpha kind of sucks, and I wish it didn't exist. that's my opinion on alpha.
I guess to sort of round off, I've got a couple of points on this. I mean, it is basically the reason it's expensive is that you're taking one pixel that's been drawn and then you're having to blend it with another one.
Yeah.
And in terms of overall bandwidth, it can be very, very taxing. Secondly, you're quite right that the ratio between compute and bandwidth hasn't been scaling in quite the same way. And if we're talking about bandwidth monsters, it's actually quite ironic that I think of the last generation consoles and even up to this one, probably the console with the best ratio between compute and bandwidth would be the PS4.
Actually, that's a good example.
which is quite remarkable, really. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think we'll close up that one. But yeah, I just hope that there have been some quite sort of bludgeoning ways to reduce that effect. So in the PlayStation 3 era, we saw stuff like quarter resolution transparencies. Still see it now, I guess. And also, even top tier developers were turning explosions into opaque orange puffs, which don't really work particularly well. So I'm going to be interested to see how developers attack this one going forward.
Actually, it's interesting. The PS4 being as balanced as it is fascinating because the PS2 was a fill rate monster, but then the PS3 came along and, well, it was kind of the opposite.
What is that one Japanese dev who was mentioning Silent Hill's remaster on PlayStation 3 being like, oh, I heard the PlayStation 3 was really terrible with transparency. What was that?
No, there was some talk from I know Yamauchi from about Gran Turismo, where he was like on PS2 they did a lot of full screen effects for like heat haze, and they were able to run the replays at 60 and have no issues like doing tons of transparency. And then suddenly on the PS3, that stuff absolutely murdered performance. And I think it gave him a really difficult time with that game. It's
kind of funny. You go back to Gran Turismo on PS3 and the car models are like so pristine, but then they intersect with any of the smoke and it's just like, it looks like 320 by 240. It's amazing.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on. Next question. I'm going to cut this down a bit because I want to talk about Patreon, but
please.
Really interesting one here. Can we have some videos where Alex, it's you again. uses his considerable knowledge to patch up, improve, and utilize super modern hardware to show off old games in a way they could never be played in the past. For instance, maybe reshade plus Marty's RTGI shaders, 8K DSR, especially games around the Crisis era. That's from Lee Ashton. What do you reckon?
I like that idea. It's almost the opposite of what we've been doing, where we go back and look at the computer from that era, playing it kind of semi-poorly, usually.
Yeah.
I do like that idea a lot. The only thing is, I don't know how many people would be super interested in it on the normal YouTube channel, but in terms of Patreon stuff, that's a pretty great idea, actually. Yeah.
Thing is, it would need to be quite impactful, wouldn't it? It would need some kind of showcase.
I think one of my favorite examples I fiddled around with. I think I showed you some of it, Alex. But
you did.
Jurassic Park Trespasser. You use reshade. I tried some of the other, the latest reshade features. When you inject that into Trespasser, you play around with it. You can get like bokeh depth of field to like kind of smooth out some of the low poly distant detail and do a lot of other fancy tricks to it to make it look really interesting in a way that it definitely was not intended to look.
I like that idea a lot, but Rich is so right. Like, I don't know, sometimes just pumping up a game with art, like reshade shaders is not always so great. They're limited, so it's hard. Yeah.
It's like the early days of Doom the 2000s of Doom Source Sports, where everybody was putting like lens flares and like effects everywhere, and it ended up making it just look kind of bad.
Not too great.
Okay, final question here. We've got some great questions here. I think I'm going to port some of them over to next week. But this final question: would it be technically possible to feature 120 FPS videos for your Patreon users, as YouTube only supports 60? You seem to be able to capture 120 FPS as you can show footage slowed down. Well, we can do that. The question is really whether the media players in like TVs and whatnot would be able to run it at 120 FPS.
Yeah.
The PC side of things shouldn't be a problem, I don't think.
It should be fine.
But we're talking about niche of a niche there, I guess. But it's something we can certainly look into.
It's always been frustrating, like exporting a lot of the assets I use are definitely captured at 120 for like the FPS boost stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got the workflow rigged up for it in Premiere where, we can import and then export 120 H.264s and no problem. So yeah, if you've got a 120 hertz PC display, that's fine.
Yeah, or a 4K TV that supports 120 hertz.
I mean, there's actually, this isn't a bad idea for... So what do we know what happens when you are given a 120 FPS H.264 or HEVC and play it on a 60 hertz screen? Do we know what happens? Really?
I think it will just drop every other frame.
If it does do that, there's nothing preventing us from taking our even 60 hertz, if you have like a Premiere timeline and it has like number of 60 FPS bits, but also 120 FPS ones on it, it will already do that frame dropping on the export action. But if you exported it as 120, it would actually keep those frames and double the 60 FPS one aspects. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that we could technically export some of our 60 FPS videos that have 120 FPS elements in them at 120 FPS for our Patreon users.
One thing to keep in mind, though, Alex, I have found on PC media players, when you play a video that does not match the refresh rate, for whatever reason, the PC sucks for video playback. I'm just going to say it. I hate it. It drives me nuts. It's so difficult to get completely consistent frame persistence with video playback. If you play a 30 FPS video on a 60 hertz display, it never looks quite right. It's always like there's always a weird frame persistence issues. So it's all, for me, I think it's always best to match it to that. But if you played, if you had that 60 hertz sections in 120 hertz video and you played it on a 120 hertz screen, then theoretically, it should be okay. Yeah, it should be okay. But if you, I don't know. It's video playback gets weird on I think, and also I've even heard that some people have issues playing HEVCs, on their PCs as is. So I don't know, maybe we'll try it and see what people think, because it shouldn't be too difficult to just capture some cool gameplay and throw it up there and let people play around.
Yeah.
Ori would be good. And I guess also we were talking about this earlier, John, but there might be a technical breakthrough happening with 4K 120 capture.
Oh, really?
That's,
What? Whoa.
That's news.
I haven't
Yeah.
heard about this.
We'll talk about it later, but potentially
I need to investigate. Should I say what it is?
No, let's see
Okay.
whether we can actually deliver something first before we tease
All right,
it too much.
all right. Yeah.
But
gosh.
but it's quite ironic, really, that most of the 120 hertz modes out there, you could actually get a perfectly good result by capturing at 1440p 120, which
Yeah.
you can do with the Ava Media cards. But we'll circle back to that. In fact, how many 4K 120 games are there? There's Ori, obviously. Actual 4K.
That's it, really.
No, there's
that I know
got to
of.
be a.
Probably going to be some simpler ones. What about the Tourist?
That is, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good one.
Stuff like that, I think, is what we have. There's not going to be many. I don't think hitting 120 hertz is difficult.
Yeah, so I want to round off by talking about Patreon because we're filming this on the day that we're relaunching, where we have no idea how this is going to be received.
That's right.
But I think we've kind of tried to do this the right way. First of all, if you're watching Digital Foundry normally, you don't have the funds to support us at all, or you can't go beyond our $5 tier. Everything crucial that you need to see, you will be seeing on the channel. There might be a bit of time delay to it, but I'm hugely. I haven't seen it quite yet, but I want to see John's Quake DF Retro. If you support DF Retro, if you invest in that, you'll get to see it earlier, but otherwise you'll get to see it a bit further on down the road. But from my perspective, we've got a video going out today which explains my thinking about the whole thing, which is that it is about trying to rebalance things a little bit. As I said earlier, back in the day, you would buy a magazine and you would be buying the products that a journalist has put together. And the quality of journalism since the magazine era, I'd say, has gone up by an order of magnitude. The amount of effort that has to go into making a video, you need to do everything that, you need to be proficient at everything you needed to be proficient at to do a magazine article. But in addition to being a great writer, you've got to be a great editor. You've got to be a great, almost like a cinematographer in a way, in terms of, making games look good and exciting and stuff like that. And it's something that we're giving away for free. And that's absolutely fine. That's the model, that's kind of the arena we've entered. But we are on YouTube, where we know nothing about the platform, where, we've seen it with a couple of channels in the past. Their views have halved overnight. They don't know why. Their income would have been slashed. It's kind of like, we just don't have any kind of control over the platform. We do the best that we can. But, this whole concept of supporting the team is, if you can, it's of crucial importance. And it goes for any of the creators, really, that are out there that you are really invested in, not just Digital Foundry. But, we have tried to produce something which is aimed at the super hardcore with the premium tier. So you'll be seeing some of the experiments I've been doing behind the scenes. This will all eventually appear as content once the research is complete. Some of the image quality analysis stuff that we're doing in the background, we can share that. But, there's no point sharing it when we publicly when we don't have a final product. But the process, we can share that. That's going to be interesting. John sent me the challenge, I've talked about it in the past, of AI upscaling the Metal Gear Solid 2 E3 2000 trailer. You'll be able to see that if you subscribe, and you'll be able to see the processes that I went through there. And awesome idea from our Patreon supporters on the Discord, which was, I was just idly talking about the archive that we've got.
Oh yeah.
And the kind of stuff that I've got going back to the year 2010. So we've got the Final Fantasy 13 assets. This face-off that I did back in the day that was like gigantic for the time. That data has been sitting on a 500 gigabyte starter hard drive for 11 years now. And basically two takeaways from that. First of all, watching those 720p assets on a modern display, it's hideous. It really is bad. And John came up with the idea of doing nearest neighbor 3x3 upscales to 4K. And the content looks really a lot better.
It does. That's how important scaling is. That's what I'm saying. Like 720p can look pretty all right still on a modern screen, but it just depends on how you scale it.
Yeah, so, that's been really interesting. It's just been stuff I've been doing in my spare time that I can share on the Patreon, and I think people are going to get a kick out of it. And there are going to be some larger scale projects, hopefully next week, maybe the week after, but hopefully next week. Alex will return with Tech Focus, which will be a time-limited exclusive for Patreon supporters. And I guess when it comes to DF Retro, DF Retro is a passion project. It's a passion project that can go in either one of two directions when we put it on YouTube. We can either do exceptionally well, which is great, but it can also not do particularly well. And in which case, the bean counters back in Digital Foundry are saying, why aren't you doing more on, PlayStation 5 and whatnot?
So why'd you do this instead of Outriders?
Yeah, Tom.
I'm sorry, all right?
Yeah. And it's a legitimate question but this comprehensively answers that by saying, look, we've got a dedicated community out there who will support Digital Foundry. It's going to be a small community, but it's 100% committed and are willing to back the creator. This is like a game changer for us.
That's my
in terms of, well, exactly, yes. Again, it's a game changer. Hopefully, we really do need your support here because it's, I urge you to watch some of these old DF Retro episodes where John has put everything into it. It's a personal passion project as well as a career. It's a vocation. This is what John was, in my opinion, put on this planet to do. Is to basically share his enthusiasm and his knowledge and his experience with these games, and to entertain the rest of us in the process, and for us to learn from it. And it's just.
It sure
phenomenal.
is fun. But
so look, I understand that the majority of people out there probably are not going to be able to support us, and you have my assurance that the content lineup on the DF YouTube channel will be unchanged. In fact, it could even be embellished a little. In fact, the fact that we're doing this show at all every week, it all derives from the DF supporter program, and. So that's not going to change. In theory, it could actually get better. But, for our mental health, for our kind of, for our sort of job satisfaction, being able to be liberated, first of all, from the brutal demands of the YouTube platform. Secondly, to share our passions and to know that there's an audience out there that appreciate it enough to support us in doing that. Hugely valuable. John, have you got anything to add to that?
No, you kind of said it all there, but yeah, this is a good opportunity for me and Audie, I guess, as well, to really do the stuff that I love to do the most, right? I do enjoy the regular comparisons and other videos as well, but this is the stuff that I think about more often, and these are the types of games I'm playing in my free time, and I just find it really exciting and interesting to explore it. But because of that, it takes more time to make this stuff, and it's harder to justify sometimes, unfortunately. So, and it's too. So yeah, this is my best hope for being able to do more of the stuff that I love, and hopefully others really do enjoy it as well. So that's the plan. The big thing is we're moving to monthly episodes now for DF Retro, because the release has been sporadic depending on what's happening in the other console space, in the modern stuff. If there's a busy period there, like launches of new machines, then it's kind of impossible to do that stuff. So, but this is a way to kind of ensure that we can actually have a regular schedule on this stuff and get the chance to do it once a month.
And a lot of this is going to feed back into the main channel. You know, if John is doing a DF Retro episode, that means that we're going to need to bring on more people to do more of the standard, analysis videos.
Yes, we need to fund the cloning program so we can have more Toms and more Alexes.
Yeah, oh gosh.
My God, can you imagine that? 2 Alexes.
I'm just curious, Rich. So if
love
John's vocation is to do DF Retro videos, what's Audie's vocation on this earth?
It's probably to annoy me.
By the way, Audie is still alive, everyone. He hasn't made an appearance in a while, but as you can see from this photo here, he's still very much alive.
He's as you'll see on the DF Retro Patreon content, he's alive and well, and he's thriving in the retro grief cave that he lives in.
We've come up with some new plans for What's in the Box, Rich, as well. So he'll be reappearing on the weekly soon because there's some bangers coming your way.
Okay, I don't really know how to take that. I think the irony is that, you know, I'm actually paying him to do this. I don't know. This is just like phenomenal. It's just like ultimate masochism. But look, that's it. That's the Patreon. It's going to be awesome. It is awesome. We've got some great stuff up there already for people who have joined the supporter program. More is coming. And wow, that DF Retro Quake episode brings back a lot of memories. I was there when it was all kicking off. I played V-Quake.
Yeah, I know. I wanted to get you in there, but ended up not really having time. But yeah, you actually had the Verite back in the day.
I did, yeah, and I've said it once, and I'll say it again. Carmack dropped that thing like a hot potato. He moved on to 3DFX, you know. I was devastated.
You're not wrong, but I mean, V-Quake is really good and has advantages over GeoQuake. And beyond that, you know, the Verite supports a bunch of Quake engine games that came after, so you can still play like Quake 2 and other things on there.
Is there ever a successor to the Verite that was just faster?
Yes.
There was the V2000, wasn't
There's
there?
the V2000 series, and I have one of those as well. But here's the thing. Because of the way V-Quake was architected, the speed doesn't really change much.
Oh, no. Is it the CPU thing? The CPU issue?
Yeah, they're basically treating it like a special software renderer, if you will, but they can do certain things on that card that you couldn't really do on a CPU at the time. That's how you get there, so... The only way to improve it a little bit, they did add a command line variable to offload certain operations to the CPU because CPUs were very slow when the rendition arrived. But you know, later on they got faster. You can actually speed it up a little bit by like shifting that away from the Verite.
Interesting. Yeah.
Well, I'm going to look forward to watching that episode because I still haven't seen it at the time of filming this.
Well, you've seen little bits and pieces.
Bits and pieces.
Yeah, but John's been sharing. Yeah.
Hugely excited. Okay, well, look, thanks guys for joining me on this one, and thank you for watching. And if you did like the content, like, subscribe, share, ring the notification bell, and what happens there? It's quite remarkable. Whenever we release a new video, you get instant notifications. DF Patreon, I'm not going to talk about that anymore. You know everything you need to know. But that's all from us for now. Thanks for watching.